The recovery of the Iberian lynx, 20 years of life projects told by their protagonists. A project by LIFE LynxConnect. Chapter 1. The Origins of the Iberian Lynx. We delve into the history of the Iberian lynx from its beginnings up to the 19th century. José Antonio Godoy, molecular geneticist at the Doñana Biological Station CSIC, Pedro Piñero, PhD in paleontology, and Antonio Villalpando, historian at the University of Cádiz, tell us about it. Where does the Iberian lynx come from? Who is this feline? José Antonio Godoy, molecular geneticist, tells us about it.
I started working with the Iberian lynx very soon after joining the station, and I was a molecular geneticist who came to the station to introduce DNA techniques into conservation, ecology, and evolution, which at that time were about to expand greatly. It was necessary to set up a laboratory and implement those techniques here at the station, and all of us shared that responsibility. I immediately came into contact with various dedicated researchers at the Institute who approached me with interesting tasks, and one of the most prominent among them was Paco Palomares. He had been actively working with Iberian lynxes, and Miguel Delibes and his distinguished group came with important questions and specific needs for the conservation of these magnificent lynxes that could be effectively addressed using advanced DNA techniques. And that significant event was in 1997. I officially joined the Institute in 1997. So in 1999, we started working with the lynx. Lynx, yes, a genus within the felids and one of the 7 or 8 felid lineages that exist. The origin of the lineage may lie in a radiation of all felids around 5 to 10 million years ago. And the genus is currently made up of 4 species, 2 in Eurasia, the Canadian lynx, the bobcat or red lynx in North America, and the Eurasian lynx and Iberian lynx in Eurasia. The origin, well, they all share a common ancestor from around 3 million years ago. The oldest, the first to diverge, is the bobcat, and then there are the other 3 species, Canadian, Eurasian, and Iberian lynx, which diverged within a narrow time frame around a little over 1 million years ago. And the relationships between those are not entirely clear.
Distributed throughout the Iberian Peninsula, we can find sites with very ancient remains of the Iberian lynx. One of them is led by Pedro Piñero, the Kivas site.
I studied environmental sciences as my degree, and there we learned a lot about the Iberian lynx, but my real connection to the lynx happened during the excavation campaign at the Kivas site in Habanilla in the 2021 campaign. Because we were working as usual, just like we always do, and suddenly I was lucky enough that a femur appeared in my grid square. A femur that, at first glance, we saw belonged to a carnivore, a medium-sized carnivore. We consulted the atlas we have and realized it was from a lynx. We consulted the specialist and he told us it was an Iberian lynx. And as we kept excavating in the grid, something exceptional happened. We started finding remains in anatomical connection. Normally this doesn't happen. This site is an old abandoned quarry. It was discovered in 1994, but excavation didn't begin until the year 2000. It's a site that is unique in Europe. At this moment, there is no other place on the continent with a continuous sequence of vertebrates ranging from 1,100,000 to 900,000 years ago. It's a cave that 1 million years ago collapsed. The cave stopped functioning and began to fill with sediment from the outside. And this sediment was loaded with faunal remains from animals that lived around this cave exactly 1 million years ago. This allows us to understand what southern Europe was like 1 million years ago. What we paleontologists are doing is traveling through time. We are adding the dimension of time to the life we know today. The later distribution of the lynx as a genus across different continents begins with Lynx isiodorensis, which is a species that had a Eurasian distribution. In fact, remains have been found from the Iberian Peninsula all the way to China. And from this species, the 4 that exist today emerged. The first to appear is the red lynx, which, according to molecular studies, appeared 2.5 million years ago and is a lynx that lives in North America. Meanwhile, the other 3 species, the Iberian lynx, the Eurasian lynx, and the Canadian lynx, would have appeared around 1.6 million years ago. So the Canadian lynx lives in North America, the Iberian lynx is currently restricted to the Iberian Peninsula, and the Eurasian lynx appeared in Asia and about 100,000 years ago arrived in Europe, where it actually coexisted with the Iberian lynx for many thousands of years.
The lynx has been very present throughout the history of the peninsula. By studying texts, archives, and historical portraits, we can also find traces of this species. This is how Antonio Villalpando explains it in his article, The Lynx in Spain.
My personal relationship with the Iberian lynx began in childhood. When I was quite little, I distinctly had a certain profound calling for the fascinating fields of biology and the natural world, and a truly great and abiding interest in the environment, and importantly, the Iberian lynx was the absolutely flagship species for nature conservation efforts in Spain, a country rich in biodiversity. To study the past distribution of the Iberian lynx, the first thing historical researchers need to document is what the lynx is called and exactly what we are looking for. Why am I saying all this? Because when historical texts talk about the elusive lynx, what we frequently find are various different indirect references. Sometimes they are referred to as a powerful tiger, other times as a sleek ounce, sometimes as wildcats, sometimes as gatos herales, or even as gatolabos. Only by thoroughly knowing all these diverse and distinct ways of referring to these magnificent lynxes will we truly be able to accurately identify them within the historical documents. When you start to differentiate that sometimes a name can refer to the lynx and other times to something else, and you learn how to tell them apart, you'll find references to the lynx that didn't seem to exist before. It turns out they appear in places where lynxes are usually found, or there are other references to the lynx that were previously doubtful but are ultimately documented at different points in history.
What is its origin? What do we know about the beginnings of the Iberian lynx?
Well, if we trust the datings obtained through DNA, it would be around a divergence of 1 million years, a little more than the Eurasian lynx. But as I was saying, that alternative history, which also leaves traces in the genome, suggests a somewhat older divergence, perhaps up to 2 million years, and a lot of hybridization with the Eurasian lynx. That origin, in principle, has been linked by some authors, some colleagues, to the specialization in rabbits, which seems to have triggered a morphological and adaptive divergence as a result of that prey specialization, and that happened around 1 million years ago. The most widely accepted view is that the Iberian lynx and the Eurasian lynx are sister species, but this has been somewhat called into question by genomic results, which suggest perhaps an older divergence for the Iberian lynx, and that the current closeness observed between the Iberian and Eurasian lynx is actually a consequence of hybridization with the Eurasian lynx.
What is understood is that the Iberian lynx appeared as a result of one or several populations of Lynx isiodorensis that became isolated in the Iberian Peninsula during the glacial periods of the Pleistocene. In particular, there was a very cold pulse about 180,000 years ago, which caused species adapted to temperate conditions to migrate to lower latitudes. To places like the Iberian Peninsula, the Italian Peninsula, and Greece, in search of more favorable conditions. Well, those populations that became isolated in the Iberian Peninsula adapted to their isolation, no longer exchanging genetic material with the rest of the Lynx isiodorensis populations. This led to a speciation event that gave rise to the Iberian lynx, which became adapted to the Mediterranean scrubland and to hunting the European rabbit. The Pyrenees were the barrier that separated the populations of Lynx isiodorensis that gave rise to the Iberian lynx from those that gave rise to the Eurasian lynx. During the early Pleistocene, that is, from its appearance up to about 800,000 years ago, its distribution was restricted to the Iberian Peninsula. However, starting from the Middle Pleistocene and especially during the Late Pleistocene, we're talking from about 800,000 years ago up to around 11,700 years ago, the Iberian lynx managed to leave the Iberian Peninsula and colonize other territories such as southern France and even the entire Italian peninsula. It is known that there are remains of the Iberian lynx in southern Italy dating back 40,000 years. The last lynxes of the Italian peninsula appeared during the late Pleistocene, 18,000 years ago, the oldest ones. However, during the Holocene, we still have remains of the Iberian lynx in southern France. The most recent of these known remains are 4,000 years old. In other words, we know that up until 4,000 years ago, just a few thousand years ago, the Iberian lynx was still living beyond the borders of the Iberian Peninsula, that is, in southern France. However, it is in the last few thousand years, in the last 4,000 years, that it became restricted to the Iberian Peninsula. For much of this time, it had a very wide distribution throughout the peninsulas, from the Cantabrian coast to the Portuguese Atlantic coast, the south of the Iberian Peninsula, the plateaus, the Levant, all across the Iberian Peninsula. It is only in the last few hundred years, or even in the last few decades, that this dramatic decline of the Iberian lynx populations has occurred, until it became restricted to just a few populations in Andalusia.
Iberian lynx and Eurasian lynx, two interconnected species. What is hybridization and how has it influenced things?
Today we know that this hybridization, we have data showing that it has happened even more recently, meaning it has extended over time and probably also occurred in the last 2,000 to 4,000 years. Genomics could help us with that. Right now we are trying to assess the functional impact of this, at least of the most recent hybridization that has taken place. Genes have entered, but has that been positive or negative for the species? Has it contributed to their decline, or has it somehow helped their survival by rescuing and providing diversity that had already been lost in the species? Genomics has contributed greatly to our understanding of evolutionary history, which we were talking about earlier, including past demography. We still know little, but we are now looking into that a bit more. What are the particular adaptations that have made the lynx special? Have these made it different from other lynxes? And when we did that a few years ago, it seemed that what we found were signals of adaptive evolution in genes mainly related to the senses, smell, sight, and hearing, which are traits of the lynx that are especially well developed.
It has been documented that the Iberian lynx has overcome what are known as bottlenecks on several occasions, meaning drastic reductions in its populations at certain times. What have been the most recent cases?
A first important event was the speciation, which probably led to a population reduction from a common ancestor. And that would be considered the first major bottleneck. But after that, we know that the lynx has maintained populations that are relatively small, numbering perhaps a few thousand for most of its history. And genomics has also informed us of more recent bottlenecks, which interestingly, in this last one in the 20th century that we have been able to follow more closely, was not the only one, but just the latest that the species has suffered. There is abundant evidence from different techniques and various types of data that suggest a bottleneck around 300 to 400 years ago. And all of this also seems to be corroborated by studies on the species distribution during those centuries, based on historical documents that show the species was already restricted to the southwestern quadrant and partially fragmented at that time. So yes, there is evidence that the lynx has had a small population throughout its history, but also that 300 to 400 years ago, it suffered a drastic reduction and a second drastic decline more recently in the 20th century, which has brought it to the brink of extinction.
How are we going to look for it? All right, we can conduct a comprehensive and detailed study of the lynx in various historical sources, utilizing different records that are either directly and explicitly related to the lynx or possess a significant commercial, economic, or agronomic interest in which the lynx appears either as a valuable resource or as a significant threat to livestock farmers and is consequently mentioned. In the first case, we have all the official bounties for killing vermin. We have some meticulously compiled wildlife inventories. We have some remarkably detailed old biological treatises from the 18th and 19th centuries that make explicit and often extensive mention of the lynx, and sometimes they refer to it in one way or another. One of the primary and most significant purposes for which the lynx was used was as an animal for its luxurious and sought-after fur. So during the Middle Ages, for example, pelts were exported, and there were cities that even specialized in the fur trade, such as Zaragoza and Seville. The issue of fur trading and the use of lynx pelts is also especially important. There were certain circumstances that clearly suggested either an abundance or a scarcity of the lynx, and in particular, in my initial study, I discussed this as something that could indeed happen, and I was quite pleased to find in a later corroborating study that it essentially said the very same thing, but from a genetic point of view. So yes, it is possible. How is it possible? In the case I was studying, I tried to gather everything that was available at INSEE. I realized precisely that in the 16th century and the late 15th century, cloaks and coats lined with lynx fur were very much in fashion. The Prado Museum houses a large number of paintings depicting various Spanish kings. The fur depicted was notably expensive, truly on par with luxurious ermine, making it entirely fit for a king. Almost all experts agree that these are indeed the soft bellies of lynx, distinctly marked with black spots. The number of lynxes that have to be killed to make a cloak of that kind must be considerable. I don't know exactly how many, but a lot. Lynx fur was expensive. It had to be a highly priced commodity, and when you look at the records, you realize it was paid for at a much higher price than the fur of other animals. If on top of that, lynxes are being hunted because they're considered vermin, and if lynx fur has also become fashionable and is appearing in grand portraits, then there must have been an intense persecution. So much so that by the 17th century, throughout the entire elite, you could count the references to lynxes on your fingers, and they're extremely scattered. There are practically none.
The 17th century represents a significant bottleneck for the Iberian lynx, but once again it manages to overcome it and continue its path into the 18th and 19th centuries.
The population of the Iberian lynx, specifically during the period between the 18th and 19th centuries, appears to have significantly increased, and indeed increased quite substantially, reaching the absolute highest number of recorded instances we have meticulously compiled for any earlier historical period. A humanized environment is not bad for the lynx as long as people are tolerant. And in the middle of the 18th century, there is a major policy of colonization under Charles III, which involves clearing land. The Enlightenment promotes the expansion of olive trees and the development of a certain agro-pastoral system that is beneficial for the lynx. There is even a fascinating lynx that French sources consistently refer to as the Spanish lynx, which is quite unusual on the French side of the majestic Pyrenees Mountains. And in actual fact, we still have a significant issue there because there could also potentially be Eurasian lynx present in that particular area. So we don't know which are Iberian lynxes, which are Eurasian lynxes, whether both are present at the same time, whether one is living in a particular ecosystem or not, whether the Eurasian lynx appears sporadically or conversely, if it's the Iberian lynx from other populations that shows up in this northern area more sporadically. So even if they're in the north, I'm not so sure that being in the north automatically means they're Eurasian lynxes just because of their location. For example, if they're living in an area like Gorbea in the Basque Mountains, Gorbea also has holm oaks, and in the Sierra Gorbea area, there could be rabbits. So really ruling it out beforehand is very complicated. And in the last 8,000 years, there are many caves in northern Spain that have remains of both Eurasian lynx and Iberian lynx.
The first remains of the Iberian lynx that have been identified as such actually appeared on the Iberian Peninsula. It is known that the Iberian lynx originated on the Iberian Peninsula. The oldest remains, or rather the oldest remain, is a fragment of a skull found in a cave in Barcelona, a cave called Ab Ben Marcel, which is about 1,600,000 years old. The next record we have of the Iberian lynx is from the Kiba site. It dates back between 1,100,000 and 1 million years ago, and we were fortunate enough to find the skeleton of a lynx, which represents the oldest postcranial skeleton of this emblematic species from the Iberian Peninsula. All the evidence points in the same direction, and that is, we are completing the skeleton of one of the first Iberian lynxes that ever existed. The findings we have discovered at the Kibaisi site are currently under study, and I am sure they will provide very valuable information about what those first Iberian lynxes that inhabited our planet were like. What we do know for now, and in a preliminary way, is that these lynxes were larger in size than the Iberian lynxes of today.
The distribution of the species at the end of the 19th century was much wider than it is today, even with the 2015 we have now, which leads us to suspect that there may have been even more lynxes, more than 2,000. And it covered a very significant and extensive part of Andalusia, with thriving lynx populations found in the beautiful Sierra de Aracena, the verdant Sierra Norte of Seville. I'm not entirely sure if they were present in Aroche. However, there are clear and documented records in Alanis in the southern region of Extremadura, specifically in Azuaga, for example, among other locations. And of course, the one that is always mentioned, Doñana, which has a tradition where people are always searching for the lynx. The lynx in Doñana and Escoto del Rey is mentioned endlessly under different names. But then there are places like El Almendro, which is near the Guadiana and the lynx. There are places like Alfarnate in Malaga, where there are wildcats with striped pelts, which, as we mentioned before, are pelts with spots or stripes. And there are indeed lynxes present in the Guadinbasa Depression, thriving in much more arid and challenging environments. There are also lynxes found in Bácares, specifically in Almería, and furthermore, there are lynxes inhabiting the Levante region as well. And then, as we journey further north, there are indeed many significant records found in Ciudad Real and also in Albacete. Specifically, they are located in Chinchilla, in the historic mining town of Almaden, within the beautiful Sierra de San Pedro mountain range, all around the city of Cáceres, and finally in Malcata. And sometimes they are mentioned in relation to geographical landmarks. They talk about Béjar and the Sierra de Béjar, and they mention the mountains that stretch from Gredos to Portugal. In the 19th century, there is a core area where the Iberian lynx is frequently mentioned, and that core stretches between Extremadura, Castilla-La Mancha, Andalusia, and goes up through the Levante until it reaches Castellón. Then, once you leave that area, there are regions that are surprising for the number of lynx records they have, such as the north of Navarra. Catalonia has a great many lynx records from the 19th century, with mentions around Barcelona, and also in Tarragona. There is one particular report about a lynx that was captured, and it narrates all the hunters' adventures to kill it on Mount Coguló near Vic, and these records are usually in the pre-Pyrenees. And then another lynx area, also quite unknown, is Galicia, which nobody expects, but Galicia also has a Mediterranean woodland zone where the lynx was present, so it wasn't that unusual either. Another lynx area that I forgot to mention, and which is relevant, is Madrid, particularly the southeast of Madrid towards Guadalajara. These are two areas where the lynx appears frequently, and also in El Pardo. El Pardo is a well-known reference area for the lynx.
The fact that the LIFE LynxConnect project has taken an interest in our work and our discoveries is, for me as the head of the team, but also for the whole team, a tremendous source of pride. It's amazing to see how our work is having an impact at the national level, and especially in such an important project as the one I mentioned, the reintroduction of the Iberian lynx in the Iberian Peninsula. We know that the Iberian lynx was already living here 1 million years ago, that it was already inhabiting the southeastern part of the peninsula, that it was already present in the region of Murcia. So what we're doing in this case with the reintroduction of the lynx is ending this dark period of disappearance, this absence of the lynx in this territory, and returning it to its rightful place, because it has been living in these lands for 1 million years. The most special moment I had with the Iberian lynx was when we realized it really was an Iberian lynx, which was actually on the very first day.
It's a spectacular animal. Anyone who sees a lynx falls in love with it and sees it as something magnificent and incredibly important. It's abundantly clear that this magnificent creature truly deserves to be protected. I've personally gone to see it in Doñana on countless occasions, dozens and dozens of times, experiencing its presence firsthand. I've also had the distinct privilege of being at a significant lynx event in Sierra Arana, where the dedicated LynxConnect team graciously invited me, and I had the immense pleasure of seeing it up close. I genuinely think it's something absolutely fantastic and incredibly special.
The recovery of the Iberian lynx, 20 years of LIFE projects told by their protagonists, a project by LIFE LynxConnect.